It's delighted to introduce this next section, which is on examples of and opportunities for systematic conservation planning in England. As I said before, yeah, the role of the SNaP Forum is really to create that community, to bring together all the relevant people. We're delighted that as a first speaker, we've got Karen Faux from Natural England, who is talking about the landscapes and seascapes that certainly surround me here in Canterbury. Yeah, it's brilliant to hear what's all the exciting things that are happening in our county. So over to you, Karen. And yes, and to flag up for all the speakers, I'll mention when there's 3 minutes to go on the 20-minute time slot. So all yours, Karen. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me. So I am going to talk about Natural England's approach to spatial planning in and across Kent. And what I'll look at is the tools that we're using, the pressures that we're dealing with, and where the big opportunities are, especially around our protected site strategies in Stodmarsh and the Kent Local Nature Recovery Strategy. So Kent is under enormous pressure. We've got rapid growth. Just in North Kent alone, in the next 20 years, we'll got local plans that are telling us there'll be 25,000 new houses. The infrastructure expansion with the Lower Thames crossing and national infrastructure is phenomenal. We've got very serious agriculture intensity problems, nutrient pressures on habitats. We've also got some amazing habitats, international significant ecosystems, SPAs, Ramsars and so forth. But all of this provides these converging pressures. And how do you actually look at them through a spatial planning awareness, which I'll come on to in a bit. And I just need to move people out the way. I can't see. And then nature, as Peter sort of set out at the beginning of this afternoon, we have some really high expectations for it, and it's got to deliver multiple benefits. So it's under a lot of pressure. So just very briefly, because I put it in, the different spatial planning frameworks that are now around. And I think on a county level, it makes it incredibly complex in how we approach spatial planning on that county level, because we're actually trying to take all of these policy frameworks and look at what that actually is tangible. What does that look like in delivery? And everybody has got a different approach to it within those frameworks, and there's not one body that's sitting over the governance of all of it. So it's a really complex situation, really exciting that we've now getting all these things to work with and support us as a tool for nature recovery, but also the complexity of it is still to be worked out. So Natural England's toolkit in Kent, the LNRS is absolutely the backbone, and again, as Peter mentioned at the beginning, it's critical to everything that we'll do going forward for nature recovery. And it sets out exactly where the pressures are and what measures we can do to achieve that. The Kent's one was published in November, and Natural England had a key role as a supporting authority to provide ecological evidence and ensure that the alignment was with national priorities and support its delivery going forward. So I just briefly want to just point that the amazing thing about the LNRS is that there'll be 48 of them, and they don't actually look at political boundaries. So although we have the challenge of devolution and so forth, we will have this national nature recovery network to work within. So it was almost 3 years, the local nature recovery strategy and its development in Kent. And at the same time, simultaneously, Natural England decided to create supranational nature reserves. 25 are proposed, with just had our halfway mark, and you'll may have seen in the press that King Charles came down to open the Super NNR in Sussex, as well as our coastal path. So North Kent Woods and Downs was the 5th at the time. So while LNRS is being while LNRS was being created in Kent, at the same time we were trying to create a super NNR with multiple partners, with Natural England not actually owning any land within that, which was quite unique at the time, as well as trying to ensure that it was aligning with the development of the LNRS to make sure that we had the right hooks once that LNRS was published, so that the North Kent Woods and Downs would become that green hub for North Kent, where we could actually start to experiment with what landscape scale delivery really looks like working with people. It's quite multiple habitats, woodland restoration, chalk grassland recovery, hedgerow and scrub connectivity, species recovery. And it's in a really squeezed area in the north of Kent and quite near the Thames. Gravesham one side, Rochester's the other, the Medway towns. So it's a real place where the partners can align their delivery. We've got about 17 partners there now. It's the North Kent Woods and Downs been declared now for a year. It took 3 years to declare it and take it through that legal process, bringing partners on board, trying to engage with that governance, what works across those different sites with different organisations. So there were challenges, but there were also so many opportunities. And again, I think what was key from the beginning of that journey was changing people's mindsets. So we have to remember, especially when we're working in this, as professionals, we're used to talking about spatial planning and it's just sort of rolls off the tongue, but these are the people that are actually going to make the difference, the site managers, those that manage the land, and bringing them along the journey. We have to remember how we use our vocabulary, what it means to them. And yep, the LNRS all sounds great to them, but actually how tangible is that? What does that mean? So within that 3-year process, we were able to get £500,000 from the Lower Thames Crossing. And that enabled us to have quite a series of strategies which start to look at landscape scale working together, as opposed to just a national trust management plan or a plant life management plan. We've brought that all together and looked at what those cross themes are and how we can sort of work that at scale. And it's a place where councils and NGOs, landowners, farmers have all come together. Unique at the time, but it looks like that model will be rolled out a little bit more across the country. But we were able to test what affiliation could look like for a national nature reserve. So there obviously is a legal process, and we were able to create a new process outside core partners that meant that we could bring a lot more landowners into that journey, and they're treated exactly the same as core partners, but not all of their business is primarily for conservation, which is the purpose of a national nature reserve. So that was quite exciting, and the Kent Downs National Landscape, which are leading on this, are really keen to increase that affiliation as we go forward. So we now really start to have that hub of partnerships, 2,000 hectares, that can start to upscale and look outside its current boundary and extend its boundary as we go on. So as part of that process, it obviously engages many other people neighbouring in the area. And we had 3 farm clusters that existed at the time, one on the Hoo Peninsula, that's the marshes. We had one on the Swale, which again is the marshes, and then we had the North Downs farm cluster gap, which sort of incorporated some of the National Nature Reserve, but also swept up quite a lot of other landowners. So those 3 farm clusters have come together, inspired by the North Kent Woods and Downs, to create Chalk to Coast. So that's a 60-mile long corridor, nature recovery corridor. It's 400 to 450 square miles. So it's pretty big. So you can see how once we start to bring these people together, how we can actually start to upscale it and really look across the piece and start to talk about the stretches of land that Peter was referring to in the beginning of the presentation. We need to do this at scale, and we need to make that joined up. So those 3 farm clusters have now become a CIC. They've got a brilliant website. The links are in one of my slides when we get to it. And it's a slow process. You have to be patient with nature recovery and spatial planning. So how do we get the baselining data, as several people have mentioned already, is probably the biggest challenge, because at the moment it costs quite a bit to get that data. So we as Natural England have invested, for example, a substantial amount of grant in order to look at the connectivity for certain species through circuitscape, and where are those bottlenecks, and where can we target within that new nature recovery network? Where do we target to ensure that they are the priority areas within it for the nightingale, dormice, lapwing, and so forth? So the LNRS underpins everything we're doing. It gives us that strategic look over the county. It also, we're working with the Essex LNRS, and we're also working with the Sussex LNRS. So it's much wider than county level, but then we have to drill down and actually make something realistic, that's workable and tangible for delivery of actually nature recovery. And they are doing really, really well. A year and a half in, they've got quite a few landowners that have pledged to join the movement. They've received quite a bit of FIPL funding to get things up and running, and they're really starting to operationalise the LNRS vision. So very exciting times in Kent. So I'm going to come on to protected site strategies now, which Peter has talked in detail about what they are. But if you think about Chalk to Coast is giving us the landscape to work within, well, the PSS gives us the mechanism to actually fix the biggest pressures within that landscape. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at pressures on those protected sites, in those spaces in between, that can actually, how can we target and focus on them in a different way that will enable us to create that connectivity, to have Chalk to Coast have that landscape that they want by affecting change on those pressures. It's very much multi-stakeholdered. It's numerous action plans, but it is legislative, so it does sit with the planning department. And up until last week, it actually had more regard in the planning framework than the LNRS. However, now obviously our new legislation has come through. The LNRS has been made incredibly stronger. So just a nice diagram that my colleague put together for his PSS, which is I'll talk about in a little bit more detail later. He couldn't make it today, but his is in the Stockmarsh catchment area. But we're moving from treating the symptoms, which was our traditional approach, and we're now looking at the root cause, whole landscape transformation. And it's obviously very collaborative, very transformational, very delivery focused, but also challenging. That's the point, isn't it? We know that. So let's look at it in a different way. It brings partners together, and already we're seeing in North Kent, for example, bringing hydrology surveys together that are happening on one peninsula, and then from an island on the other, and then we start to say, okay, well, where's the gaps for that hydrology information that we need? Because we really need to understand at scale Where do we want to put those interventions? Where is the water wanting to sit? It's a very, very dry landscape up there in certain places. It's under enormous stress, and it will continue to be under more stress with the growth agenda. So North Kent Nightingale's Protected Site Strategy is the first single species one in England. It was agreed October last year. It's very much emerging. So what this can do, as I've sort of previously mentioned, it looks at the supranational nature reserve, the North Kent Woods and Downs. It looks at chalk to coast. It works in that landscape, and it starts to look at those pressures. So already we've identified the hydrology is a big pressure, the air quality, recreation, predation, and housing growth. It will combine all that ecological data, all the LNRS data, but it looks at behaviour as well, and it starts to work with people and bring people along that journey, which is utterly critical if we want to affect change. So having a flagship species like nightingale for North Kent, which has the stronghold in the country, is actually pretty exciting, something that our communities can connect with. If I had a penny for everyone that said to me, I can't remember the last time I heard a nightingale, then I'd already be quite rich. So the aim is we've got, I think I've put a map in. Yes, it's a nice picture of a nightingale. You've got about a month for them to come back from Africa. So there are hotspots in Kent, and as you can see, the more density, the more territories we've got. I've been talking a lot about the northern side. And you can see just from that map, the connectivity is going to be tricky. They're tricky species. They've got all sorts of weird and wonderful things that's just bespoke to them. So although we'll look at the whole assemblage for woodland birds, invertebrates, we'll also be looking to tweak it specifically for nightingales. Quite a lot of investment. We've had a county nightingale research group set up, been going now a year and a half. That's now going to expand to a PSS nightingale group, which will include developers, builders, Homes England, as well as our usual suspects. It's very much about bringing everybody on board that's working in that space to see how we can work together and affect change and effectively deliver the local nature recovery strategy. So I've sort of touched on this already about the multiple pressures and how they interact. So one of the things that Natural England senior staff and specialists have said to us in the area team is, that's great. You could spend years just looking at air quality. So we have to focus down. That's hard. But where we can, we will bring in those interventions looking at all of the pressures. But we will focus certainly on predation and settlement edge effects, because we know that they're the most critical in the way we've prioritised the priorities. So critical
and
for
just 3 minutes to go, Karen, if that's okay.
Okay. All right, we won't do Stodmarsh. Critical for delivery of the local nature recovery strategy, it is looking at buffers, scrub hedgerow networks, quiet cores, lighting design, access management, and green finance packages. So very much protected site strategies are about bringing in private green finance. And so whatever we're doing, we're looking at those corporates and trying to ascertain how we can make these projects investable, which the LNRS set out for us, and now we go into the detail of delivery. All right, I'm going to skip across, as I've only got 3 minutes. So we have another one, very briefly. That's the area in East Kent, Stodmarsh, and that's looking at nutrient neutrality. significant for Kent is that this area will obviously get its first environmental delivery plan, which Peter talked a bit more about earlier, and that will have a nature restoration fund that comes with that. So there will be some at least 10 years sustainable pot of funding from developers as we go forward. You can look at the slides to find out what it's trying to achieve, but I guess you'll get the gist anyway. So I think I just wanted to really quickly talk about the strengths in Kent. We have really good high resolution habitat and species mapping. We've got connectivity modelling. Some of that was done as part of the local nature recovery strategy, and some of that's being done funded by us. Mentioned the hydrological surveys, they're huge. They're massive amounts of money to get that absolute detail for the wading birds. We've got really good, strong partnerships and a fantastic community out there. And when you look at other maps across the counties, it's surprisingly how little some counties have in terms of farm clusters. Kent is going from strength to strength, and nearly all the county is now covered by a cluster, which is brilliant for us to be able to work with them at scale. I've talked about them to a degree. I'll move that one forward, but there are some challenges. Some of it we've talked about already. Sort of that mismatch, just particularly as we go into devolution, but between ecology and the planning cycles, there's a key challenge on data, there's a key challenge on boundaries not being aligned, fragmented governance with all those strategies and how we work that all together. LNRS is the backbone, and it will provide that coordinated delivery in collaboration with those key partners across the county. And I will leave it there so that I've finished on time. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Karen. And yeah, a brilliant overview of all the amazing work that Natural England are doing with all the partners. And yeah, really nice detail on the sorts of things that we need to account for. You know, if we're going to do spatial planning that informs action on the ground, it's complicated and will involve a lot of people. So no, that was brilliant to get that overview. So thank you very much. And next up, we've got David Baker.
Right. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for inviting me to speak. It's been great listening to everyone else's talk. It's good to follow on from the previous talk. I'm going to focus on developing Cornwall's local nature recovery strategy. And I'm really going to focus more on how we went about developing a new model to sort of bespoke for the strategy, and just talk about the actual LNRS at the end. I just want to also flag this is very much a big collaboration, particularly with Siddharth, who is a brilliant mathematician who helped develop the models, Marcus, Ilya and Kevin, who helped drive the local nature recovery strategy. So this work really came out of a big project called the Renew Project. And the Renew Project is focused on a people in nature approach to renewing biodiversity. So acknowledging that people are usually the barriers and enablers of nature recovery action, and trying to understand how to work better with people to help deliver nature recovery. It's a big NERC funded project, 70 or so researchers, led by the University of Exeter and National Trust, with many partners. One of the main themes, led by Ilya McLean, is a theme focused on how do biodiversity renewal activities, how can they be designed and delivered by a diverse set of land managers in the UK context. And as part of that work, I've been developing these sort of spatial prioritization approaches. And really, this is motivated by these sort of biodiversity targets we have. So we've had these historic declines of species, and now we need to halt these declines by 2030 and increase the species abundance by at least 10% by 2042, which are really ambitious and really hard to do. And much of the research that we've done and others have done over the years has shown that to achieve these targets, we really require spatially targeted activity. So we know that untargeted actions can have very little effect on reversing specific species declines. When you target those actions towards species, specific actions in specific parts of the landscape, you can actually achieve good results and more efficiently. So targeted actions are more efficient and more effective. So our work was really inspired by the UK context, and actually when the Cornwall Council came to us to talk about local nature recovery strategy, it was a really good spur for us to actually start thinking about, well, how do we actually design spatial prioritization tools that work in the UK landscape? And the particular challenge we have is that most of the space for developing nature recovery opportunities are on sort of converted land. So land cleared of natural vegetation for agriculture. And that might go back centuries, millennia of cleared land. And we don't necessarily have a reference historic natural vegetation state to restore the habitat back to. And we sort of have a slightly blank slate in the landscape. We also have a situation where most of our remaining species, most of the species we're interested in increasing in abundance, are isolated to remnant habitat patches, highly fragmented, distributed around the landscape, often very small patch sizes. And the other big challenge we have is that we don't have much space for nature, really, given that we're also competing with lots of other demands on land for housing, food, carbon, etc. So this creates some interesting challenges for spatially targeting nature recovery actions and developing spatial prioritization tools. It means that we're primarily focusing on targeting the creation of new habitat in historically converted landscapes, so converting improved grassland to sort of woodland or heathland in a landscape. Also, there are often multiple potential habitat types that we could create on any land without a reference state. It's just what we choose is based on whether the underlying soil conditions or hydrological conditions are suitable to create that habitat. And we can even manipulate those hydrological conditions to some degree. So for any given land parcel in the landscape, we might have many options of what we could do there, which creates a really complex challenge. For any given habitat we create on any given location, it affects the species assemblage that occurs there. So our actions affect the species assemblages, and that's not just about the resources and conditions we create, it's also about the spatial connectivity to existing sites. So a heathland in a particular location might be suitable from the habitat point of view, but maybe it's so distant from existing heathland that we can't facilitate the dispersal of the species onto that site. And then the final big problem is, because we have this substantial competition for land and limited space for nature recovery, we really have to be very efficient with the way that we target our nature recovery action. So we might want to cover the landscape in woodland, but then we wouldn't have anywhere to grow food. So we need to actually be really efficient in the way we target our actions in order to deliver outcomes. So this is the problem we're really facing. We have a very blank landscape, and we're interested in trying to work out what actions we should take in which part of the landscape to achieve our objectives. So identifying sets of actions across the landscape to meet targets. And this is really a very challenging spatial prioritization problem. So we set about sort of framing the problem, and first of all, by just framing it as, given a collection of features, they're usually species, but not necessarily. So given a collection of species and targets for recovery, so this might be increasing the area occupied by those species in the landscape by 10 or 20%. We need to find sets of actions that meet those targets while minimizing costs and spatial disaggregation. And the spatial disaggregation component is aligned with the sort of more bigger, better joined component of the Lawson review. It's about creating bigger patches, ensuring connectivity. In those decisions, we need to take account of species-specific habitat requirements. So we need to know, given that you create a woodland or a heathland at a particular site, what species are going to be able to take advantage of those. But it's not just about the habitat suitability of the landscape, it's also about the accessibility. So we need to understand the movement of species through the landscape and whether species can actually access those new habitats you've created. And then also we need to account for spatially varying and action-dependent costs, because we know that different actions cost different amounts and different land has different value and can be more expensive to restore. So we created this spatial prioritization model for nature recovery with multiple options for habitat creation. It's called Ebrel. My colleague Siddharth named it Ebrel because Ebrel is Cornish for the month of April, which is a period of biodiversity renewal. So the model aims to address this question. So what spatial configuration of conservation actions enable us to achieve our biodiversity targets while balancing other land use priorities? And the model works by proposing a set of actions in the landscape. So that might be on any given land parcel. You either leave it as it is, or you convert it to a woodland or a species-rich grassland, whatever is indicated as suitable in that landscape. You propose a set of actions across the landscape, and then you evaluate that solution with respect to the costs of the actions, the degree of spatial habitat aggregation or fragmentation of the landscape, so getting back to those Lawton principles. And then you evaluate the contribution of the actions to meeting specified nature recovery targets for this chosen collective of species. And then what you do is you use an algorithm that continually tries to refine those sets of actions, suggests new actions in the landscape, evaluates whether they improve, whether they help you meet the targets, whether they improve the spatial aggregation, etc. And they try to find a good set of recovery actions that allows you to meet the specific recovery targets while minimizing the costs and the habitat fragmentation. So this is an example of a case study we did on the lizard. So you start off, this is a random start. You don't have to randomly start the model. You can hot start it, but this was randomly started. You select one of these 10 actions plus doing nothing. You seed the landscape with those actions. You run through, iterating through, looking for better and better solutions. And over time, you can see what it does is it spatially aggregates different types of habitat. It finds the better options in different parts of the landscape. And actually, towards the end, it just tries to refine the solution to produce a more efficient outcome. And the graph at the bottom just shows that when the red and black lines converge, you've met all your targets, and now you're just ending up with a more efficient solution if you run it longer. So the data inputs for the model are feature layers. So these are layers of sort of species current distributions. We also need information on the existing habitat types. Then we have these opportunity layers that we spent quite a long time developing, where they, on any land parcel, they say what you could convert that to based on the soil and hydrological conditions and microclimate. And then these cost layers, they can be any particular costs you want. You can implement those on those layers. And the cost layers are associated with each specific habitat opportunity and land parcel. And then you might have some unavailable areas. Those are masked out on tiles. A matrix that links the habitat opportunities with each individual feature. So this says, can a feature benefit from those, that particular habitat type? Then you have a dispersal matrix, which tells you how far your species can disperse on average, and a nature recovery target, which is for each individual species. So the dispersal data is actually used, is actually the sort of heart of the model. The dispersal function actually aims to try and understand whether a species can actually access a new action from where it currently occurs. So in this example, from this distribution on the left, the species actually can't quite make this access this new patch that's been suggested here. So that wouldn't count towards its target, its biodiversity target. In this other solution over here, once A and B are suggested and A and B are both suitable for that species, the species can then hop across the landscape and access both sites. This is the main core of the model that makes it more sort of biologically realistic. And then we can also account for co-benefits of nature recovery in the model, either through the cost layer or as conservation features. So we can think about nature-based solutions for flooding or access to nature. We can wait away from a high-value agricultural land, or we can also think about carbon sequestration in the landscape. So just moving on to our use of this model in the Cornwall and City Local Nature Recovery Strategy. So we co-developed this with the Cornwall Council. This was led by Philippa Hoskin at Cornwall Council, as the environment lead there. And it was really a great partnership between them and the university. So I'm sure we all know, but the Local Nature Recovery Strategy is a system of spatial strategies for nature and environment improvement required by law under the Environment Act. So first of all, we have to agree local priorities for nature recovery and map those existing areas that are valuable for nature. And then our job really at this point was to map specific proposals for creating or improving habitat for nature and the wider environment goals. And our focus down here was in Cornwall. So this really was a systematic conservation planning exercise. We had numerous stakeholder engagements throughout. We consulted with the public, species experts, local NGOs, and we had multiple consultations throughout the whole process. It was target driven, with the targets and the species and features that were important informed by those consultations. And it was driven by data provided in part by the record centres around here. So really great collaboration across the Cornwall region. And then the selection process used to identify subsets of locations and actions was underpinned by an Ebrel model. If that wasn't the be all or end all, we had input outside of that as well. But the fundamental actions were designed by Ebrel. And there's a paper I have here that describes some of our approach to that. So this was the map that was produced. We ended up aiming for a high coverage of nature recovery actions across the landscape. You can see we end up with quite a lot of spatial aggregation in habitat patches, so creating nice big chunks of patches. Some of the linear features were put in afterwards because the model doesn't capture necessarily that well the riverine systems at the moment. But it was really detailed mapping, and I think really appreciated in the planning process so far. And importantly, the coverage was high. We aimed actually for around 50% coverage of the landscape with existing and opportunities, understanding that not all of that is going to be implemented over time. And what was quite interesting was the number of species we managed to get into the spatial prioritization algorithm. So we had over 440 species that we eventually were able to map and put into that exercise. So these included vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, fungi, lichens, really broad suite of species, which meant that it's really quite representative of the broader range of species in the region. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll leave it there. But so there's more information on the Cornwall LNRS found at that link, and this was basically funded by the Renew Project and Cornwall Council. There's a paper on our spatial prioritisation for nature recovery paper there. And if you want any more information, please feel free to contact me. Is that okay, Bob?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you, David. And it's really nice to hear you talk that through. Having read those articles, and really enjoyed them. It's nice to get the audiobook version with pictures. So no, that was excellent. And yeah, I'm sure people on the call know that University of Exeter is one of the sort of core places for systematic conservation planning work here, and I mean, as are several universities represented here today. So it's really nice to see that sort of tie-in with academic excellence and influencing the LNRSs. So thank you very much. Okay, so I think the last talk in this section is our very own James Barton. Are you there, James?
Yep, I'm here.
Lovely. Yes, so James is doing his PhD at DICE and has been doing lots of cool stuff that he's going to tell us about now.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. Okay, yeah, so thank you, Bob. So yeah, as Bob mentioned, I'm a third-year PhD student here at DICE, just started my third year. My PhD is supervised by Professor Zoe Davies and Professor Bob Smith. And as part of this piece of research, I've also been working with Dr. Laura Kaur and Dr. Dave Seaman from the innovation team here at DICE. And also we've been collaborating with Kent Wildlife Trust and a new initiative they're heavily involved in called Rebuilding Nature, which is an initiative looking to bring together lots of stakeholders across the UK to try and look at investing in scale in landscapes across the UK. And that's going to be the focus of my talk today. I'm looking at investing in nature at scale and how we can try and make sure we do this in the right place through spatial planning. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about a spatial framework that we've been developing across England to identify landscapes for large-scale investment in nature. So to give a bit of context about nature finance, there's estimated to be a $700 billion biodiversity funding gap across the world. And the recognition to try and close this funding gap is seen in Global Biodiversity Framework Target 19, which seeks to mobilise $200 billion per year for biodiversity by 2030. And within this target, they specifically mention leveraging private finance and trying to attract the private sector to invest in biodiversity-related activities. And this recognition of the private sector needing to try and help close this funding gap has given rise to nature markets across the world as a way to try and attract this private finance. And these nature markets work by creating a unit of nature that can be sold on a market as a nature credit. But as we look to scale up this private investment through nature markets, there's a number of barriers that we'll be seeing across nature markets all across the world, where projects are often too small and fragmented to attract some of the largest sums of money these investors are looking to give to these markets. From the landowner point of view, there's a lot of high costs to set up that project relative to the revenue that they could generate in these markets, which discourages them from engaging in them. And then again, from the investor side, the political and market uncertainty and ecological reputational risks associated with some of these markets just discourages the investors from engaging in these markets. So very briefly, just to outline how these nature markets actually work, if some of you aren't aware. Like any market, we have our buyers, which is where the demand for these environmental services come from. And these are generally split into either a compliance market, where developers are required by law to offset their impacts that they have on nature, and also on a voluntary basis, where corporations may be looking to meet their environmental sustainability goals by engaging in these nature markets. And responding to this demand, we have our sellers, which generate the supply of these environmental services. And these are typically landowners, or we're seeing in the UK, biodiversity net gain habitat bank companies that are buying up pieces of land and undergoing a land management change to generate some of these environmental services. And once these environmental services have been created, they go through an accreditation framework whereby the amount of environmental services are quantified and sold as a credit on the market. So, for example, if you plant a woodland, the thing you'll be crediting is the tons of carbon stored by that woodland, and that is what's sold on the market. Now, moving towards England, focusing on England, sorry, there's estimated to be a 21 to 53 billion pound funding gap in England. And a recent estimate from last year showed that just 142 million pounds of private investment was directed to nature-related activities in this country, which accounts for just 13% of nature-related finance. The vast majority still being public money through agri-environment schemes. And recently, the UK government set a policy target of attracting £1 billion per year in nature-related finance by 2030. So as you can see, by 2030, to meet this policy target, we need about a 7-fold increase in private investment in England. And the main mechanisms underpinning of our hope of achieving this target is the operational nature markets that we currently have here in England. So we've mentioned before biodiversity net gain. It's a mandatory offset market where developers have to offset their impacts on the environment plus and increase that by 10%. Nutrient neutrality is another mandatory mitigation market where developers have to buy nutrient credits to offset the amount of pollution that is caused by their development. But this is only operational in certain catchments that Natural England have designated as being particularly sensitive, as you can see here on the map in orange. And finally, we have our voluntary nature-based credit markets here in England, which are predominantly in the form of woodland creation and peatland restoration. So as we look to try and scale this private investment, one of the ways that we're seeing it, one of the things that we're seeing in England is this shift towards more landscape scale delivery. And this is being encouraged through DEFRA grants, through blended finance mechanisms where landowners within an area can access public money with the view that will also increase private investment in their nature-related activities. And by looking at a landscape scale, this is all about aggregating landowners, increasing knowledge sharing, being able to track these larger sums of money. And this is all about reducing risk for both the investors and the landowners. But as we shift towards this more landscape scale delivery, there is a risk that we do our nature investment in the wrong places. So for example, in the offsite BNG scheme, we're already seeing habitats being created within a very narrow set of habitat types and not always aligning with biodiversity priority and not being invested in the right places. So as we shift towards this more landscape scale delivery, try and scale up this private investment, we need to make sure we're doing this in the right places. And this is where our work comes in. So we've been aiming to develop a spatial framework that will act as a decision support tool for directing this nature investment towards landscapes with high revenue potential and ecological value. And this is our framework here, this 3-step framework. I'll go into more detail on each step in just a moment, but broadly speaking, we begin by defining and mapping our criteria. We then use these habitat opportunity layers to estimate the revenue potential from each of our nature finance mechanisms. And then we undergo a spatial analysis to identify the locations with the greatest revenue potential. Now, just to flag up, I will mainly be focusing on the revenue side today, but I will briefly mention how we're incorporating ecological stuff in this as well in another one of my chapters. So now, yeah, I'm going to share with you each step of the methodology behind each step of this framework. So the first step, where we map our habitat opportunity layers, we begin by identifying our opportunity areas, and we selected land parcels on that are low-grade arable land and improved grassland. And this is because these are the most common baseline habitats currently seen in the BNG market, and this is because when you're generating nature credits, you want to maximize the uplift through your habitat creation. So we want to start with a low nature values to increase. When we do our habitat creation, we can maximize the amount of credits that we can generate. So we have our opportunity area land parcels. We then predict the suitable habitat types that can be created on those land parcels based on environmental variables such as soil, elevation, soil pH, hydrology as well. And as David mentioned earlier, you can often do multiple you can create multiple habitats on a single piece of land. So what we did was we prioritized the habitat creation based on rarity within different regions across England. And this gave us our final habitat opportunity map. So each of our arable and improved grass and land parcels have been now assigned a habitat creation type. And the next step was to estimate the revenue potential that could be generated from this habitat creation for each of our finance mechanisms. So we used the relevant documentation for each mechanism. So for BNG, that's the the biodiversity metric. For nutrient neutrality, that's the nutrient calculator developed by Natural England, and for the carbon credits, we use this big review of the amount of carbon that can be stored and sequestered by its habitat type here in the UK over a 30-year period. And once we use these calculation metrics to estimate the number of credits generated through habitat creation. We then multiplied this by the credit prices of each finance mechanism that we sourced from a market analysis, which gave us our gross revenue estimate. And after accounting for the costs of actually creating that habitat, this gave us our net revenue estimate. So this image on the right here of my screen is essentially showing that within our planning region, each arable land and improved grassland land parcel has been assigned a net revenue estimate for each finance mechanism based on the habitat type that we decided would be created on that land parcel. And this brings us to the final step of our framework, where we underwent the spatial analysis to actually look at where these investment landscapes could take place. So we used a moving window spatial analysis, whereby within your planning region, you have a circular window that moves across your planning region and sort of summarizes the information within that area. And in our case, what we did was we moved this window across our planning region to aggregate the net revenue of each of our finance mechanisms across our area over a 30-year period. So each, and this allowed us to essentially rank each of these windows within our planning region by revenue potential for each finance mechanism. And we ran this across the whole of England, as I mentioned earlier. But when we were developing this framework, we wanted to embed this principle of representativeness into it. So people have spoken about this before. It's a core principle of systematic conservation planning, whereby you want your priority areas to best represent the biodiversity within your planning region. And we did this by aggregating England's natural character areas into 13 biogeographic regions, following the approach of Natural England's Living England Habitat Map, which is a spatial layer with the habitat types in England. And yeah, as I said, when we ran this, we then ran this analysis across each of these 13 regions to identify the highest revenue landscape within each of these regions, to ensure the likelihood that it will represent England's biodiversity. And this is what the outputs from our spatial analysis look like for each of our finance mechanisms. So as you can see, that the red dots are the highest revenue window within each of our regions, and the heat map is showing the relative revenue potential of each finance mechanism. So for biodiversity net gain, this revenue potential is fairly evenly distributed across the country. For nutrient neutrality, we're clustering these high revenue locations within the operational catchments, as you can see in the heat map there. And for carbon credits, this net revenue distribution is significantly more clustered in the upland and sort of marshy areas of England, where you can generate credits from both peatland and woodland restoration. And one interesting thing, or just one thing that I wanted to flag, was that of how much more revenue you can generate from BNG relative to the other two mechanisms. And this is, I think, quite interesting when we think about scaling these nature markets. BNG in this country is a mandatory market, so whenever a development happens, they have to buy BNG credits off-site if they can't do it on-site. So this is quite unique compared to the other two. Nutrient neutrality is a bit early, but particularly in terms of the carbon credit market, which is voluntary, whereby this demand is fairly consistent across the country, and there is scope that with BNG being hopefully expanded to nationally significant infrastructure projects in this country, this demand will increase. So these credit prices are high because they factor in, they've been properly priced by the government, working with landowners to make sure they're fairly paid for their nature restoration, nature creation, habitat creation work. but also what's reflected in the cost of development in these credits. So kind of they have to, because development has to do it, kind of this is reflected within these credit prices. So when we talk about scaling this private finance in this country, BNG is a good one that we can think about. And this figure here, I included to sort of highlight the importance of representativeness in this framework. So without accounting for representativeness, our high investment landscapes would likely be clustering in just a few biogeographic regions. So by spreading them out across our country and maximising that likelihood that we're representing different regions' biodiversity in England. So how do we see our framework being applied as a decision support tool? So firstly, we see it as being used to identify candidate nature investment landscapes within your planning region. So within your planning region, you can use this framework to look at areas that will likely generate a lot of credits from your nature finance mechanism. And we also see it as being really useful to maximise your ecological outcomes alongside your nature investment, alongside the nature investment. So as part of another chapter that I'm doing, we're looking at some of the trade-offs between maximising our ecological outcomes alongside our nature investment outcomes. So, for example, if you want your nature investment landscapes to represent a number of priority species, an area of priority habitats, a certain amount of designated sites, you can easily feed that into the framework and make sure that your investment landscapes represent or meet those thresholds that you're selecting for those different ecological conditions. We also see it as being useful to reveal financial trade-offs. So as well as looking at where there can be revenue generated from existing finance mechanisms, it can also highlight where there's areas that these nature markets may not well finance. And this is where you might need to bring in your public money to do your nature restoration and creation work. And we also see it as being very flexible to being extended to new markets and mechanisms as they emerge. So, for example, if a natural flood management scheme was to be implemented in this country, that could very easily be fed into this framework, and we could use that across your planning region as well. And finally, we see it as being very useful when you have demand side data that you can integrate into this framework. So within your planning region or across your country, where you know how much demand is expected to be there for a given mechanism, you can kind of use that as your budget when you run this movement window analysis. And just on this last point, finally, I just wanted to flag how we are integrating this demand side data into the spatial framework where we're able to actually collect it. So as part of another chapter of my PhD, we're looking to estimate the contribution of biodiversity net gain to delivering local nature priorities here in Kent. So we collected the Kent housing allocation data, which is where we're expecting housing developments to take place. And from that, you can estimate your BNG market demand. So the amount of units that are likely to be generated off-site from this housing can be used as your demand. And then by matching that with your supply, so the amount of credits that could be generated from LNRS potential measures, you can actually run this through a prioritisation approach to ensure that you can prioritise the delivery of your biodiversity units that are matched to the demand. So that's just to sort of flag, although the framework doesn't explicitly include demand side data, we are thinking about how this can be integrated into these sort of approaches. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to taking questions if you have any a bit later.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Yeah, that's a lovely overview of what you've been doing. And yeah, I think as hopefully you all agree, it's a very exciting project that's, again, brings the principles of systematic conservation planning to particular contexts to answer really important questions. So yeah, thank you so much. Right, well, yeah, thank you to all three speakers for three brilliant talks. Again, really getting to the heart of what we need to think about in systematic conservation planning.